In this lesson, we are going to look at Psych-ed assessments. We are interested in learning what they can tell us about our dyslexic students. What information can they give us that will help us to inform our teaching? The first question that we'll look at is, what exactly is a psychological educational assessment, otherwise known as a Psych-ed assessment? Well, first off, it's a psychological test. I like to think of it as a test that analyzes two main areas. On one side, it's analyzing the brain power of the student. And by that, I mean the mental processes underlying his or her educational performance. These are things like verbal and visual abilities, processing speed, attention, memory. All of that stuff is what they bring to the table, their brain power, the raw brain power. And then the test also analyzes how the child is actually performing at school. So what's their reading level, what's their writing level, mathematics skills, how are their behavioral skills and social emotional functioning. Many people think that the Psych-ed assessment is a scary thing, but it's actually a wonderful thing, because in addition to showing us the areas of need, it shows us the areas of strength that the child has. So who should get a Psych-ed assessment? And at what age should a child get tested? Some school districts make the claim that it's better to wait until a child's in grade 4 for that test. But this doesn't follow modern thinking. Psychologists from the Toronto Psychological Services say that we should begin testing children at the age of 6. They believe that one cannot downplay the importance of timing, especially when referring to having an early psychological educational assessment completed. They say that the earlier a child receives a Psych-ed assessment, the earlier insights can be gleaned about your child's learning style to help ensure that they develop to their full potential. We know that in the case of reading, it's very important to catch the problem early and remediate the problem early. When I take on a new student for a reading remediation program, I always look at the Psych-ed assessment if they've had one done. I do this for two reasons. The first one is it gives me insight into the specific challenges that that child may have. There might be compounding factors that might make it even difficult for that person to learn to read, or there might be behavioral challenges or emotional challenges that also play into how I'm going to teach that child. The second reason is that parents often come to me with their child's Psych-ed assessment because they have no idea what it means. So I help them map it out, and then it allows them to see their child's wonderful strengths as well as their areas of difficulty. There are 6 basic parts to a Psych-ed assessment. The first part is the background information. And this is where people who work with the child speak about their experience, and they tell the child's strengths and weaknesses. These sources might be family members, teachers, school records, people who are on the child's school-based team, could be people who give it background information. The second section is called behavioral observations, and the person who is actually administering the Psych-ed assessment completes this part, and they make notes on how the child behaved during the testing. The third section is a simple list of what tests were administered during the Psych-ed assessment. And the fourth is a cognitive profile. So this is the section of the assessment where it says, here's how the child scored on the tests and procedures that were listed in section 3. And then the fifth section is called current performance levels. And this is a measurement of the child's current ability levels in reading, writing, and math. At the end of the Psych-ed assessment, there's a summary and recommendation section. And this is where the person who did the test is drawing conclusions about what those tests mean, what those results mean. And based on what they saw, what the child showed, then they'll make recommendations for different programs that might be useful for the child, or different adaptive tools that the child could use to help them with their disability if they have one. So let's look at a sample Psych-ed assessment that I just made up. And the first section of a Psych-ed assessment we said was the background information. So here's how that might look. There'll be some referral details saying why Ben was referred to get the Psych-ed assessment. And in this case, Ben is a grade 3 student who struggles with reading and writing, especially phonetic awareness and decoding. So that tells us right away, red flag, we might be dealing with a dyslexic person. Ben was originally in French immersion at Hawthorne Elementary. This year he switched to Jerome Elementary, where he's now being instructed in English. From his current teacher, we know that Ben is curious and has strong math skills, is musically creative, and enjoys performing skills. Ben's oral language development is above average, but he is hesitant to answer questions in class or to write. He's frequently off task and can be disruptive. He has some speech sound difficulties. His written language and reading skills are below average. His printing is below average. But when we look at the school records, it seems like a very different Ben when we look at how he was in kindergarten. He has excellent motor coordination, a growing French vocabulary, and strong math skills. Here he's kind and works well with others. He struggles to name sounds and letters in French. So it sounds like from the very beginning, Ben's difficulty with attaching the correct symbol to the correct sound was evidenced. But you can see there's a change in Ben's behavior if you look at how he is from grade 1 to grade 2 and now to grade 3, where he can be frequently off task and disruptive. Ben has not had access to a proper reading remediation, and he is showing signs of growing increasingly disruptive in class as his needs are not met. Parents also have the chance to add information to the Psych-ed assessment, and this is the place where the word dyslexia can find its way into a Psych-ed assessment. Some school districts won't use that word. They say it's a medical term, and they will talk about a phonetic awareness deficit, but they won't actually use the word dyslexia. For some parents, that's a powerful word and they would like it in the document, so this is the section where they have the opportunity to put that word in. Here, it says, the parent says there's a history of dyslexia in Ben's family. When Ben was younger, he had difficulty hearing rhymes. And that's interesting to note because in prior lessons we learned that not being able to hear rhymes is one of those red flags for dyslexia, as is a history of dyslexia in your family. The next section of the Psych-ed assessment is called behavioral observations. And this is where the person who administered the Psych-ed assessment discusses the noted behaviors in the student as he or she completed the test. In this case, the person says that Ben talked a lot and quickly. He vocalized much of his thinking and chattered about it, possibly out of nervousness. His body language was generally calm, although he was fidgety in his chair at times. Fair enough, this is a long test. It can take 2 hours on one day, and then they'll have the child back for the second day, and it takes another 2 hours. It says he used his right hand for pencil work. Ben said that he liked recess, math, and being outdoors. He said that he doesn't like time at his desk. Overall, these test results are considered to be an accurate and fair reflection of Ben's current level of cognitive and academic functioning. The next section on a Psych-ed assessment is called Assessment Techniques. And it's a simple list of the tests and procedures that were administered during the Psych-ed assessment. You'll have different tests depending on the different needs of the child, like depends on what the child was referred for. So in this case, Ben was referred because he suspected as having a reading and writing deficit. So for that reason, these tests are going to address that issue. The one that we're really going to look at in depth is called the whisk, and it's the first one in the list. It looks at the general intellectual ability, and it determines your strengths and your weaknesses in 5 different areas of intelligence. The 5 factors are combined, and they reveal something that we call the full-scale IQ score. The next area. The whisk analyzes 5 different areas of intelligence. The first one is verbal comprehension. Someone with a high verbal comprehension we call the librarian brain or the attorney brain. The second area is visual spatial awareness. And this would be an architect brain or a Lego brain. The next one is fluid reasoning. Someone who's great at problem solving, like we call that the detective brain. The next one is working memory, someone who can keep all the little parts in order. The general manager brain, we call that one. And the last one is processing speed, and that would be the clerk brain. We'll go on in detail about each one of these so you understand them thoroughly. Verbal comprehension, the librarian or attorney brain, is defined as the ability to reason with previously learned information. It's important to note that in this part of the test, the student is giving verbal answers. There's no writing involved. So we're looking at what purely is that student's brain power. If the student has a writing disability, we're not putting the disability into the equation. We're taking it out by simply having verbal answers. There's 2 primary areas that are measured. So you might see the words similarities or vocabulary. And sometimes secondary areas that are measured are information and comprehension. The questions might look like this. How are morning and afternoon alike? And then the student would provide a verbal answer to that. The verbal answers are accessing common sense reasoning, or they might be retrieving word associations. They might be describing meanings of words. And once again, this is the librarian or attorney brain. Verbal spatial is the architect brain, or the Lego brain we also say. By definition, it is the ability to reason using visual stimuli. It requires visual perception, organization, and reasoning with visually presented non-verbal materials. You can see if you're actually looking at a Psych-ed assessment, then you'll see the words block design and visual puzzles, and you'll know that that's relating to verbal spatial. And you can look in the examples and see that you're either be given graphics, different pieces of a puzzle, and you'll have to know what shape those will make when they're put together, or they'll actually give you the materials there and you'll put it together. Fluid reasoning is that detective brain or the problem solver brain. By definition, it's the ability to think logically in novel situations. When you're looking at a Psych-ed assessment, the words that you look for to find the fluid reasoning test parts would be figure weights, matrix reasoning, and if they did the secondary areas, then they were measuring picture concepts or arithmetic. Examples of questions that you might find on a Psych-ed assessment to measure this would be, do you see the figures inside these boxes? They form a pattern. Choose a figure in the answer row below that continues the pattern. Or figure weights is another one that you often see. So which one of these point to the answer choices weighs the same as this? Point to the star on the left side of the question mark. Working memory is the general manager brain. By definition, it's the ability to remember auditory and visual information long enough to perform mental operations on it. On the Psych-ed assessment, you'll be looking for digital span, will be one of the things, and picture span. Some of the examples that I provided would be the tester might say, I'm going to say some numbers, and then I want you to repeat them exactly as I said them. 8924017. And then the student would repeat those numbers. Or the student must point to a picture from the top row that shares a characteristic in common with the picture from the bottom row. Notice again that the student is giving verbal answers. They are not doing any writing. And when they do picture span questions, they point to give the answer. Processing speed is known as the Clerk brain, and by definition it means the ability to perform simple clerical tasks. On the Psych-ed assessment, you'll be looking for words such as coding and symbol search. And a coding question might look like the example I provided here. It says the student must write the symbol corresponding to each numeral on the worksheet provided. And then there's a second symbol search example that I showed you as well. The important thing to note here is that for the first time, students are being required to write the answers. This will affect the score for some students who have problems with writing because it's bringing their disability into the test for the first time. Do you remember Ben? Well, let's see how he did on his whisk. On this chart, you can see in the green there's the primary indexes. Now these are the 5 different areas of intelligence that we've looked at so far. On the left column, you'll see the word subset. Those are the different individual tests, each one relating to the different primary indexes. And then in the middle, there's the scaled scores. In order to understand what those scores mean, we have to understand that the scaled scores between 8 and 12 are considered average. So anything that's scored lower than 8 is something that we really need to look at. And anything that's above 12 is above average, so that's really interesting information too. When we take the scores of all 5 intelligence areas as a whole, we can get a full scale IQ for Ben. On his test, his composite score is 105, and his percentile rank is 63rd. That means that he scored higher than 63% of his peers, which is an average score. If we look at his general ability index, then we see that he scored higher. His composite score is 111, and his percentile rank is 77th, which is high average. For Ben, because we suspect that we're dealing with reading and writing disabilities, this is a fairer way to judge his intelligence because the general ability index takes the processing speed out. So if you looked at the 4 tests instead of the processing speed, because the processing speed involves writing, right? Remember we were requiring him to write down his answers? So if you take the writing out of it, take the disability out of it, he's actually in the high average range. This slide shows the different tests that get grouped together in the analysis portion. So the person, when they're trying to figure out what is a person's cognitive proficiency, well, they look at working memory and processing speed. So Ben would come out as a low average there because we know that his processing speed is low average and his working memory is in the 50th percentile. So those are two of his lower scores. Whereas when we look at his general ability, well, that's where he shines with his verbal comprehension because he's in the 88th percentile rank there. And it also takes into consideration visual, spatial, and fluid reasoning. And then there's the nonverbal analysis as well there. The whisk is a great test, but it doesn't tell the whole story. The tester will do other tests as well to make sure that the results of one test are valid. We want to duplicate those results in different tests to make sure that we're getting accurate results. So the Berry VMI6 tests, the VMI6, the DTVP3, and the CTOP are all common tests that you would see that would be administered on a Psych-ed for a person like Ben. So the Berry is used to figure out how Ben retains both auditory and visual information. And it turns out that Ben actually is below average in that area. He was asked to copy a series of forms. This verifies what the whisk showed because we know in the processing speed it was a low score for him as well, below average. So this is verification that the whisk was accurate. The second one, the VMI6 and the DTVP3, on this battery of tests, Ben's scores were higher. All areas were average except for figure ground. So turns out he's got good eye-hand coordination. His visual motor integration is above average. His visual perception is average. Figure ground is an interesting one. That's like finding Waldo. So you'll have one thing that you're looking for amid a whole bunch of other distractors, and he was below average there. Auditory processing. So parts of this test were given to determine whether Ben's phonological processing skills are a factor in his difficulties at school. His phonological awareness was below average, so that's a really critical piece of information. And it's interesting that his rapid automatic naming was average. So this is I point to something and I call it a chair, and maybe someone else takes a little bit longer to come to that realization it's a chair or to say it's a chair, the rapid naming. If he was below average in this area, then I would know that I would have to, it would be even harder to do the reading remediation because it would be possible that he would have double dyslexia, which is a thing. And then memory, his auditory and visual working memory are both mid-average. Long-term memory is high average. So Ben's test scores are showing that he's bringing a lot to the table. His general ability index shows that he's quite a smart guy. So this is why his achievement scores are really interesting. His accurate word reading and decoding and math problem solving and spelling are unexpectedly weaker than predicted, and also below average for his age. All of his other academic skills are at least average. So this gets to the heart of what is dyslexia, because it's an unexpected problem. When you look at what he's bringing to the table, he's bringing to the table a lot, and yet his performance doesn't reflect that. One thing that I always do is graph out the results of the tests on the Psych-ed assessment, and this really helps parents to visualize their students' traits and challenges. So most people fall in the middle when they take this test, and that's why the bump is really big in the middle. Average people are between -1 standard deviation and +1 SD, which is +1 standard deviation. So they'll fall somewhere in between there. And the average person is right smack in the middle on that 100. So the only things you really need to know to understand how to use this is mean and standard deviations, and we'll talk about that soon. When we're analyzing what's happening on this bell curve, we're using the discrepancy model. So we're looking for, is there a substantial difference between the IQ of the person, what they're bringing to the table, what they showed on the whisk results, versus what they're achieving academically. And other tests that we've done will show that. The accepted criteria for identifying a student as having a learning disability with this model is that they must have a difference between their IQ and their academic achievement of at least 2 standard deviations. And another way of saying that is 30 points. So we'll look at what that means on the next slide. Let's imagine that a child had a full-scale IQ of 105, and you can see in blue where we would mark it on the graph, and they had a reading score of 100. If we know that a learning disability is identified as a discrepancy of 2 standard deviations, would you think that this person had a reading disability? Click on the slide to reveal the answer. What about this child who has a full-scale IQ of 85 and a reading score of 83? Would this child qualify as having a reading disability according to the discrepancy model? Click on the slide to find out. Finally, what if we had a child who had a full-scale IQ of 100 and a reading score of 69? The graph shows the discrepancy between these 2 scores. Would this child qualify to have a reading disability? Click on the slide to find out. Now it's your turn to do some mapping. Let's map Ben's test results on a bell curve to determine if he has a learning disability. You need Ben's test results sheet and the blank bell curve sheet. You can choose a partner or work on your own. and then you can just start mapping. Afterwards, go to the next slide to check your results and take some time to share your reflections. In the conclusion section of the Psych-ed assessment, this is where we find out that Ben meets the ministry's criteria for a learning disability in reading, spelling, and mathematics. And then there'll be, in section B there, they will use the criteria from the DSM-5, and they will actually quote the different parts of the DSM-5 that apply to Ben's specific learning disability. Dyslexia is not a word that's used in that document, so the word won't come up in this section. We know that Ben has impairment in word reading accuracy, impairment in written expression and spelling accuracy, and with impairment in mathematics in problem solving. So when we go on to make an IEP for Ben, those are the areas that we will address. Finally, the tester will make some recommendations about different adaptations or programs that would be really good for Ben to solve his specific problems. And I took some of these recommendations right out of my son's Psych-ed assessment. Finally, the tester will make some recommendations about different adaptations or programs that would be really good for Ben to solve his specific problems. And I took some of these recommendations right out of my son's Psych-ed assessment. It's hard not to see the huge gap between the tester's recommendations, which are what she knows that a specific school district will provide to Ben, and what Ben needs so that he can become a successful reader and writer. Because we know that what he needs is a proven, strategic, intensive reading intervention. Luckily for Ben, that's where we come in.